So thank you all for joining us on our second day of this 3-day event, Science Fiction from the Middle East, or Science Fiction in Translation from the Middle East. I am Karen Grunberg. I direct the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, which is the sort of co-host, co-sponsor of this event. I myself don't work on science fiction. I do work on the Gothic in Hebrew. So I think that's kind of adjacent sort of research. And I'm very, very excited to be here to present our panelists for this next panel, which is kind of our scholarly panel in this kind of mixed event, hybrid in more ways than one. We had an in-person talk yesterday by an author and a scholar, and the panel that we are about to have today, and I hope you were all able to join us for that wonderful talk yesterday. And today we have 3 scholars who work on science fiction originally written in different languages, Middle Eastern languages. So I'm going to just go ahead and get into those introductions and remind you all about the second event, author event that we have later today. Lavi Tidhar, an Israeli-born writer of science fiction who publishes in Hebrew and in English. And tomorrow we have another author panel with Maria Dadush and Sonia Nimmer. And I really hope you can join us for that. It's going to be pretty amazing as well. So with that said, and hopefully your calendars marked and Zoom links saved for those events, I'll go ahead and get into introducing our panelists today. And I think what we'll do is save all questions until all 3 panelists have had a chance to present. And that way we make sure that we have enough time to address all 3 of them. So our first speaker today is Dr. Oded Nir, who is Associate Professor of Hebrew at Queens College, City University of New York. His first book, Signatures of Struggle, presents a new interpretation of Israeli literary history, demonstrating how literary engagement with national ideology allows literature to reflect on the changing contradictions of capitalism in Israel. He's published extensively on Israeli culture and on Israel-Palestine. His work on Israeli speculative fiction has appeared or is forthcoming in the journals ASAP Journal, and Historical Materialism, as well as the volume Israeli Speculative Fiction and Others. His talk today is titled The Rise of Israeli Speculative Fiction. Dr. Nir.
Okay, thank you, Karen, for this wonderful introduction. So let me share. I've got a small presentation because it's mostly about literature, but here we go. Is this fine? Is everybody seeing this? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So first, I would like to thank Julie and the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. I'm really, really excited to see more interest in Middle Eastern and specifically Israeli speculative fiction. It's difficult these days to talk about art or literature when the frame of reference is that of the Middle East. It may seem a pointless endeavor to talk about literature when horrible violence is taking place and Gaza has been reduced to something out of a post-apocalyptic film or an apocalyptic film. But I've always believed that during times like these, we need thinking more than ever. As Brecht put it in his motto for the Swedenborg poems, during dark times, there will be singing about the dark times. This singing or art distracts us from events themselves, but it is also a form of thinking that would otherwise not take place. Or at least that would be my argument today about the dramatic rise of Israeli speculative fiction in the 21st century. What I will try to do very quickly is to argue that there is nothing spontaneous or obvious about this transformation. Rather, it has to do with significant social shifts in Israel, ones that require the development of new cultural codes and new ways of imagining one's place in the world. There are multiple genres and forms in which this is done, but today I will limit myself to the way in which speculative fiction, and particularly science fiction, comes to flourish. I will start by talking a little bit about the development that leads to this flourishing, and then I'll offer a reading of 2 novels, Asaf Gavron's Hydromania and Said Kashua's Let It Be Morning. These readings will emphasize what the new speculative fiction, I think, makes it possible to imagine. So I'd like to begin with the prehistory of this dramatic rise of Israeli speculative fiction. It's not that speculative fiction didn't exist in Hebrew and Israeli fiction between the 21st century, but it didn't name a dominant group of genres or texts, but of a relatively small strata. The appearance of Hebrew utopians in the 19th century is one example, and also the dystopias from the 1980s, like Amos Kenan's Road to Ein Harod, or there are other ones. These earlier instances are significant, and there's no doubt that they function as important generic predecessors to contemporary Israeli speculative fiction. But one has to stress the dramatic rise in numbers of published and visible works of Hebrew speculative works in the 21st century. And it should be clear here that I'm looking at this as a sudden growth in terms of genres, science fiction and fantasy primarily, and their various subgenres. There's a crucial difference, I think, between these genres proper and earlier works that include supernatural or even speculative elements, from Agnon all the way to Orly Castle-Bloom in Hebrew fiction. And I can talk more about that difference in the Q&A if that's interesting. What I want to argue is that the recent flourishing of Hebrew speculative fiction has to do with the crisis of Israeli national allegory, which is a term I'm borrowing from the critic Frederick Jameson. National allegory should not be identified with a celebration of nationalism. Rather, it is a set of literary forms that belong to a specific collective project. They are not primarily about national ideology or nationalism. They work by bringing together the heterogeneous parts of the reality in which we live, drawing interesting connections between them. In this way, they allow us to perceive the social contradictions which we inhabit and give us a sense of history in motion. Ever since Romanticism, allegories do not have some easy moral of the story. The opposite is true. Their social significance is to be found in the contradictions and gaps between the different codes they invoke. In the history of Hebrew literature, national allegory forms in the late 19th century. It includes both realists like Mendeley, Moher Sfarim, and the forgotten works of Zionist realism of the early 20th century, but also the line that runs from, let's say, Yosef Chaim Brenner all the way to Samech Izhar and Yehudit Hendel, and ends in the late modernism of Amalia Kahana Carmon, Amos Oz, and others in the 60s and 70s, to name just a few figures. For the purposes of this talk, I want to emphasize two elements of this national allegory that belongs to two incommensurable orders. One has to do with the use of Hebrew language, and the other has to do with the overall formal construction of plots. As is well known, the rise of Jewish national liberation is intimately tied with the formation of modern Hebrew. There is no way to invoke the name of a place or the name of a character or its milieu in Hebrew national allegory that is not already bound with some kind of a host of meanings, even when the literary work itself ostensibly criticizes nationalism. To mention a kibbutz is to invoke the whole of Zionist temporality, and to mention the name Ovadia is to invoke the tension between Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi ones, and as well as class division. And to bring up Palestinians is to invoke otherness with a capital O. A forest is a whole national enterprise, while cities, especially Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, have their own ambivalent place here. The very structure of sentences, one that came to be defined what it is to be Hebrew literature, harks back to both the use of ancient Hebrew, its appropriation and negation in modern Hebrew, and the negation of other languages by modernizing Hebrew itself in Mendeley or Berdichevsky and other figures. Now, my argument is that in the 1980s, this Hebrew national allegory goes into crisis in what we sometimes call Hebrew postmodernism. And we can take Orly Castle-Bloom, Edgar Keret, or Ronit Matalon as examples here. In the works of all these authors, you can see how national allegory kind of like stops functioning. The older codes become, in the 80s and 90s, an imitation of their previous existence in what Adorno called pastiche. You can approach this crisis in multiple ways. On one level, it can be described as the eclipsing of a collective project by capitalism, the logic of a commodity completely subsuming Israeli experience. On a more social register, we can talk about the emergence of a new bourgeoisie and middle classes whose social experience has very little to do with the codes of national allegory. Their lives are much more dominated directly by market demands than by state institutions. The structure of feeling, to use Raymond Williams's term, is far more akin to American or European middle classes than that of Israelis living in West Bank settlements, or to religious communities, or to the impoverished Israelis living in peripheral towns, let alone the lives of Palestinians. To put it bluntly, the assumed codes of national allegory are no longer significantly shared by these new social groups. I think this is a good place finally to move to talking about the two literary works I want to briefly discuss, because they demonstrate precisely how this social transformation requires the emergence of a new language and a new cultural imaginary, and depends on new modes of cultural dissemination. Now, if you're a reader of Hebrew fiction in Hebrew and you pick up a random work of new speculative fiction in Hebrew, you'll immediately be struck by what seems like ugliness. The language itself seems ugly or degraded. I think this is the reason why many critics avoid this body of work. But this ugly language is one of the greatest strengths of the new speculative fiction. And you can quite immediately see where this language is coming from, because the writers of this new body of fiction have a completely different social background than the older writers. Asaf Gavron, for example, on whose novel I'll be talking, comes from the world of advertisement and commentary about leisure culture. Other writers come from the world of hard sciences, like Karen Landsman or Vered Doctorman. Very few of them are part of the older national literary institutions and literary academia. In other words, they come precisely from these new classes that I've mentioned. Now, the feel of this new language is a bit difficult to demonstrate in translation, but I have here a quote from Landsman's The Heart of the Circle, which I think captures to a degree this new tendency. So I'm just reading what you're seeing on the screen. The day after the murder, we sat in a circle at the basement. Their food sucks, the alcohol selection leaves much to be desired, but there are books lining every inch of the walls, the smell of wood and music you don't have to scream over to have a conversation. It was hot and damp, typical for mid-July. The air conditioner powerless against a room packed with people wearing sullen pouts. We sat on the side couch next to the shelves crammed with books, sock puppets, and burnt out candles. This beginning evokes a murder, but the way the setting is described evokes precisely this kind of journalistic leisure commentary, a kind of very articulate and sophisticated Yelp review of a description, which immediately brings us closer to the world of cultural consumption. Now, Asaf Gavron's Hydromania is a good example of the new language of Hebrew speculative fiction. Hydromania takes place in a future in which water has been completely commodified in what remains of Israel. Water is not a common good, but a precious commodity, and a daily struggle to survive is constructed around the ability to secure enough water. Not only its dissemination, but the production of rainfall is completely controlled by international corporations. The plot of the novel revolves around the heroine's fight against these corporations as she seeks to use an invention for collecting water for a small community, independently of these corporations' control. On the level of plot, I want to bring up two matters. First, that Hydromania is a story in which Israel is over or is dead. Geopolitical shifts now have Palestinians gradually taking over Israeli territory, and only international pressures keeps remnant of Israel alive in some form. But weirdly, Hydromania is not a dystopia. This is an important distinction from other speculative novels that are recently published. Recently, we have the translation of Ishai Sarí's The Third Temple, probably the most well-known one, and other dystopias, in which fears of the collapse of Israel are precisely what is dramatized. We should keep in mind, as Cheryl Vint and other theorists of science fiction reminds us, that science fiction should never be taken literally as a prediction about the future, but rather should be read for the way it estranges our present. Thus, in Hydromania, the death of Israel is a subplot, one that is subordinate to a larger construction. This is a suspension or neutralization of the way we tend to think about Israel geopolitically, which allows something else to come to the fore as a determining instance. So we have a text that isn't a dystopia, isn't about fear, but at the same time makes the categories that we use to think about Israel simply irrelevant. It is, I think, a great act of literary freedom of the imagination. What comes immediately to the fore in this case are the realities of class antagonism. Since corporations are what dictates geopolitical relations, the plot of Israel's demise is subordinated to class tension. Importantly, the spatial imagination of the novel reflects this. It is common in older national allegories to see the tension, for example, between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, as somehow capturing the defining tension of Israeli society. But Gavron chooses to structure the novel around the opposition between the cities of Tiberias and Caesarea, both of which, by the way, reminds us of the Roman Empire, something that I won't be able to get to here. Tiberias is where the remains of Israeli government are in the novel, and in the present connote poverty in the life of the lower classes, which the state tries to protect. Caesarea in the novel is precisely where the unbridled capitalism reigns. It is the seat of corporate power, where the local rich reside and the impoverished 99% live in desperation in the outskirts. As the novel progresses, we learn that Tiberias was occupied by Palestine, which signals the complete end of Israeli nationhood, but also, more importantly, the only source of water that wasn't commodified. In terms of language, the language of Hydromania is thoroughly Americanized Hebrew. In contrast to older national allegories, this Americanized language does not appear as a sign of otherness or as a provocation, as it sometimes does in the fiction of, for example, Edgar Keret. Rather, it is the hegemonic Hebrew of the novel. Names of characters are another area where Hebrew is severed from the older national allegories. They sometimes echo older Hebrew names, but full of reference to other cultural contexts, such as the Chinese one, because of the rise of Chinese corporate power. Again, returning to the point that science fiction is essentially about the present, I argue that Hydromania wants us to see Israeli society today as primarily structured by class and the contradictions of capitalism. And that national allegory, whatever remains of it, is the mediator of these deeper social structure. So here we finally have a way contemporary science fiction takes the place of the older national allegory, inventing a new way in which Israeli society is allegorized. But I want to move to my second example, Syed Kashua's Let It Be Morning, published a few years before Hydromania. This novel, too, unfortunately, doesn't seem too far from our reality lately. The novel's protagonist is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, a journalist who returns to the Palestinian town in which he grew up with his family after spending many years in one of Israel's large cities. The protagonist is reluctantly relocating to the town, mentioning intensifying Israeli racism and the high cost of living as the main reason for the return. A short while after his return, the Israeli military unexpectedly surrounds the town and puts it under total blockade. Electricity, the means of communication, and even water and food supplies are completely cut off with no explanation. News are weirdly silent about the blockade, which is an unusual event. Palestinian towns that were captured in Israel in 1948, whose inhabitants formally have Israeli citizenship, do not often today experience the same direct military repression that is common to the Palestinian cities in the West Bank or Gaza. Important here is that the novel is narrated from the perspective of a Palestinian citizen of Israel in his hometown. Immediately, the different oppositions of the familiar Israeli national allegory will be missing. There are no Jewish Israeli archetypes, and the town itself does not invoke any of the valences of meanings that are associated with any Jewish Israeli locales. Now, Let It Be Morning actually still uses what we would consider good or beautiful Hebrew, in contrast to most of the recent science fiction. But it makes use of a different representational vehicle to achieve its purpose. that I want to call partial abstraction from detail or actual events. Very quickly, I should add that abstraction or removal of concrete details is present in older national allegories too. For example, in the 1960s or 70s literature of Oz and Yehoshua, you will find few identifying markers of places and times. In these older cases, abstraction is applied very totally and helps highlight the allegorical structure of the work. But I think Kashua uses abstraction differently. Take, for instance, this following quote. I can recall the day when I was sent to cover the Arab demonstrations in Wadi Ara after the cabinet members put in an appearance at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I must have been the only journalist on the scene working for an Israeli paper, since as an Arab, I had no trouble getting into the villages and standing around with the demonstrators. 2 days and more than a dozen casualties later, the riots were over. But no, nothing has gone back to what it was before. Ever since those days, something has been broken, something has died. 2 days of demonstrations have been enough for the state to delegitimize its Arab population, to repudiate their citizenship. Now, what happens here, I think, is a case of partial abstraction. The novel invokes an incident very familiar to those who follow Israeli history. Prime Ministers Ariel Sharon visit to the Temple Mount, to Al-Aqsa, the primary Muslim holy site in Jerusalem. The event sparked what is known as the Second Intifada in September of 2000. But peculiarly, the speaker doesn't mention it was the prime minister, nor does it name the Second Intifada. In addition, the vague reference to repudiating the citizenship of 1948 Palestinians is very equivocal in the Hebrew original. It seems close to suggesting the revocation of this citizenship, which didn't happen. Kashua then is invoking a specific historical event just to not let us completely identify it. The overall effect of these cases of partial abstraction is to allow us to read the novel on two registers. First, as witnessing the experiences of Palestinian citizens of Israel, which is how critics usually read it. But there is a second register here. By evoking real events and then disrupting their identification, the novel suggests a more general frame of reference. So here's my main argument about the novel, that it allows us to read it as an allegory of Israeli society as a whole. And here we can briefly mention the social content of the novel, the growing antagonism between religious extremists and secular forces in the town, the results of impoverishment in the turn to illicit economic activity in drug trade, producing pornographic films, and so forth. And the constant presence of media from the whole world, mediated by the TV and the internet, which has only partial connections to the realities of the town. I think the novel's partial abstraction actually suggests that we see all of these problems as those of Israel in general. Again, like in the case of Hydromania, what you get here are social antagonisms without their national mediation. So to conclude very briefly, I tried to argue today that there is a reason for the rise of Israeli speculative fiction in the last 2 decades, one which has to do with the crisis of national allegory. This crisis means that new classes of Israeli society can no longer imagine their lives and their historical moment using the previous available tools. What I try to argue is that speculative fiction grows as a response to that, allowing us again to imagine the contradictions of life in Israel and perhaps imagine a different future. So we're not dealing here with Elana Gomel's famous coining of limbotopia, those texts whose fear is to be trapped forever in a permanent, unchanging present. This permanent present was always the hidden secret of Israeli postmodernism that signaled the crisis of an older national allegorical mode. Rather, contemporary Hebrew speculative fiction tries to make the movement of history perceivable again. Thank you.
Thank you, Oded. Sorry, I was finishing my notes there. What a wonderful talk. Thanks so much. As I said before we began, we'll save all our questions until after all three panelists have spoken. So we'll go ahead and move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Buran Utku. She is a full-time lecturer in the Department of English at Texas A&M University. She specializes in Anglo-American fiction and world literature with a focus on science fiction and speculative fiction. Her research spans eco-digital post-humanities, film, media and culture, the Anthropocene, eco-criticism, new materialism, feminist technoscience studies, with a keen interest in AI, VR, AR, and post-human studies. Dr. Buran serves as the co-founding and managing editor of the Journal of Posthumanism and is the editor of Transnational Press London's Posthumanism series. Her recent publications include Technologies of Feminist Speculative Fiction, Gender, Artificial Life, and Politics of Reproduction, published by Palgrave in 2022, and the Anthology of Turkish Science Fiction, Transnational Press London, 2022. Currently, she's working on religious futurisms with Liverpool University Press and Beyond the Occident, Perspectives on Past, Present, and Speculative Future in Fiction, Art, Media, and Film with Routledge. In addition, she's a committee member of BIPOC Shadow Division, Head of Science Fiction Studies at IAFA, and serves as Turkey's representative on the Innovative Research Award Committee at SFRA. Her presentation today is titled The Anthology of Turkish Science Fiction.
Thank you so much, Karen, for this beautiful introduction. Good morning from sunny Florida, where I live in Tampa area. I extend my heartfelt thanks to the University of Arizona Center of Middle Eastern Studies and University of Texas at Austin for organizing this great conference. Also, of course, special thanks to Julie Ellison for inviting me to speak on our first anthology of Turkish science fiction today. I also want to thank my co-editor, Dr. Willy Uğur from Muğla University, our proofreader, Dr. Conrad Scott, and cover designer Sezai Özden for this beautiful artwork featured in my slides. Before I begin, I would like to take a moment to honor and pay tribute to one of our contributing authors of this anthology and tell the story of the cover of our book. You may recall on February 6th last year, a 7.9 magnitude earthquake hit Turkey at 4 a.m., affecting over 15 cities and resulting in hundreds of deaths and thousands of homeless. This collective trauma has led to heartbreaking consequences with over 40,000 lives lost in southern Turkey and northern Syria. Unfortunately, one of our authors, Turkan Bozkurt, a relatively known feminist utopian writer, passed away under the rubble in this devastating earthquake last year. In honor of Turkan, we included her story in its original form without editing or revision, as she hadn't had such kind of time. That's why for the cover design, we chose a depiction of Göbekli Tepe, as Turkan's story featured the Göbekli Tepe temple. I don't know if you know, it is located in the eastern part of Turkey, the starting point of history and religion of human being. Sezai Özden, one of our authors and comic book artist, drew and designed the cover, and may her soul rest in peace. Creating the first Turkish science fiction story anthology has been a long-term project of mine, sparkled by discovering rare Ottoman-era works at the University of California, Riverside Science Fiction Special Collections Library, where I was working as a visiting assistant at that time. I reached out to notable authors and science fiction communities in Turkey, but received limited interest due to concerns about translation costs and constraints on free expression. I patiently waited for about a year to complete this project. So during this time, I met Şeyda Aydın, the first Turkish queer cyberpunk writer. She sent me her novels, which I then analyzed and taught at SFRI, Science Fiction Research Association conferences and other events. Following this, I began representing the works of Sadık Yemni, the first Sci-Fi, I call it like that, Sufi science fiction, writer of Dutch and Turkish origin. I even edited the English translation of his latest novel, Aryan, which was published by Transnational Press London as part of the Posthuman series I'm editing. Similarly, I edited Melike Kuyumcu's collection of posthuman short stories, More Than Human Tales, also part of the same series. I continue to support many local authors in this way. So after these positive developments, I founded the Turkish Science Fiction Research Center on Facebook. I continued to motivate other writers and try to show them that it wasn't impossible. So opening up Anatolian science fiction with a history spanning over 100 years since the late Ottoman Empire to the international community was important to me. Eventually, responses to my call for papers started coming in. I researched Turkish literature departments and looked for a faculty specializing in science fiction located in Turkey. I found Associate Professor Veli Uğur at Muğla University, and I immediately invited him to be the co-editor in my project, which provided motivation to the local science fiction authors as well. So the toughest part was managing the relationship between translators, authors, and even the publishing house. The publisher sponsoring this project insisted that each story should not exceed 300 words. So editing the stories with each of the 35 authors took a considerable amount of time. The selection process was challenging as we received more than 200 submissions. So that's why we formed a jury of award-winning authors and sent the submissions for blind review. Some of the others withdrew due to the word limit, and others because of their stories touched upon political issues in Turkey, which could be problematic due to lack of you got it. So some authors, especially the queer writers I mentioned earlier, didn't even encourage themselves to participate. So our final count dropped to 35. The project was laborious and exhausting, but it finally got published, and now the second edition is about to release. So I assisted Dr. Conrad Scott, my colleague who is living in Canada, and friend in the proofreading stage. Conrad, unfamiliar with Turkish science fiction's cultural terms, idioms, and proverbs, struggled at times. So I often stepped in to find a middle ground between translators, writers, and the proofreader. I'm grateful for Conrad's patience and effort. So we co-edited the book's copy together with Conrad and the other co-editor Veli as well. So we wore many hats in this project. So I'm very proud of this project and hope we can continue our anthology series more easily in the future. So this anthology is the first collection of Turkish science fiction short stories published in English, coinciding with the centenary of the Turkish Republic. It aims to document 100 years journey of Turkish science fiction and make it accessible to international readers. Despite its rich history, Anatolian history, Turkish science fiction has faced recognition challenges due to translation issues. So this collection features works from 33 contemporary Turkish authors, showcasing the genre's diversity and promoting cultural exchange. So let me briefly mention about the brief of history of Turkish science fiction. Science fiction was introduced to Turkish readers in late 19th century during the Ottoman Empire's decline. Reforms like Tanzimat Edict of 1839 fostered Western-style education, and private newspapers had highlighted scientific advancement, leading to Fenni novels centered on scientific themes, primarily translated from Jules Verne's. So in Ottoman Turkish, Fenni means scientific, and these novels are often included in contemporary technological machines. So as an original source, fiction emerged. Ahmet Mithat Efendi's works, such as Sauron in Europe, became prominent. In early 20th century, Turkish authors focused on utopian science fiction. Refik Halit Karay's Hülya Biya also criticizes the Ankara government's denial of the Ottoman Empire's decline. Cemil Cahit's Journey to Mars reflects Turkish advancement in space travel and serves as an example of first contact with aliens. Halikarnas Balıkçısı, The Fisherman of Halikarnassus, critiques the new republic's bureaucratic systems, revealing tensions between liberal aspirations and economic monopolies. Despite Turkey's promising background in science fiction, it lacks a robust science fiction cinema. While some Turkish films incorporate sci-fi elements, they often blend comedy and adventure, missing deeper thematic exploration. So Turkey's first sci-fi TV series, Akıncı, just released last year, features the Ottoman superhero in contemporary Istanbul, marking a significant entry in televised science fiction. So the Turkish film industry has a rich legacy, particularly during the 1950s Yeşilçam era, producing over 300 films annually. So including adaptations of Hollywood sci-fi blockbusters that highlights its unique contribution to the genre. The evolution of science fiction in Turkish cinema began in 1950s with local remakes of Hollywood films such as Tarzan in Istanbul, Dracula in Istanbul, The first Turkish sci-fi remake, Invisible Man in Istanbul, was released in 1955, telling the story of a chemist seeking revenge using invisible serum. The same year, Turkey also produced its first alien film, Flying Saucer over Istanbul, featuring Amazon aliens who abduct men with robots' help. In late 1960s, Turkey produced a series of films featuring killing series, Killing in Istanbul, Female Killing, and Killing Against Frankenstein. So post-World War II, political literature dominated Turkey, limiting science fiction's growth. However, interest revived in 1970s. Metin Atak's Planets at War or Arena depict human-alien conflicts with Ibrahim Ethem Pirate Osman promotes Islamist themes. In 1973, Turkey introduced a superhero team concept with three giant men, like Captain America or Spider-Man, like Tarkan versus the Vikings. So Ömer the Tourist in Star Trek humorously depict Sadi Alışık's character on Starship Enterprise during an arranged marriage and predating the original Star Trek film. Meanwhile, Orhan Duru coined the term bilim kurgu, that means science fiction, in 1973, and Selma Mine, female leader, Cisvanul X Unknown journal in 1967. Double the Turkish Star Wars, The Man Who Saved the World, became so famous, combined sci-fi and adventure influences like Indiana Jones or Flash Gordon, starred by the art actor Cüneyt Arkın. In 2006, the sequel, The Son of the Man Who Saved the World, features an older Arkın who passed away recently. But it was Turkey's answer to E.T., featuring a somewhat frightening alien companion. After 1980s, Turkish science fiction literature expanded. Let me just show you one of the famous movies, Gora, Arok, and Arif V216. Some of Turkey's highest grossing films are science fiction comedies featuring Cem Yılmaz. This trilogy begins with Gora, followed by Arok and Arif. These films center on humorous carpet salesmen adopted by aliens to the planet Gora, offering a high-quality, laugh-out entertainment. So, after 1980s, notable science fiction subgenres emerged, including First Contact stories, where friendly aliens abduct humans, in contrast to Hollywood sci-fi. So this is the only difference, that Turkish sci-fi comedies just mock the Western films. Oh, I don't know how to stop this. Okay. And this is another one I strongly suggest you to watch this movie. This is called Grain, inspired by a character from Quran, and it explores Sufi perspectives in post-apocalyptic world, divided between urban and agricultural zones, both ruled by corporations. The city's agricultural plantations face a genetic crisis, making it the first sci-fi film to realistically depict an agricultural scenario with theological themes.
He argued that we would never be able to create.
And this is another one. Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is another one on Netflix, Skull. So it is set in dystopian world where an epidemic spreads through verbal communication, pursued by a clinical institution fighting a linguistic immune to the disease. So in fiction, amidst growing environmental issues, science fiction novelists have contributed to the ecological science fiction genre. And this is another one, you might be familiar with this one. In 2019, it is released as Git, delves into post-humanity through the discovery of the gate in Göbekli as you've seen in the movie. That opens to parallel universes based on Strangle Boy Dutch novel Awakening of the World. It follows Atiye, a young painter, as she unreveals her past, questioning boundaries of reality and spirituality. So we can call this as a Sci-Fi science fiction as well, along with the parallel verse, multiverse, or cosmology. And this one is It's S24, a Turkish Netflix series, offers a fresh note of Franco-Belgian series Into the Light. You might be familiar Into the Light from Netflix. So it is the first spin-off from Into the Light. So
Hello, can you see me and hear me?
We can.
I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened to the other computer. It just stopped and tried to make a huge noise. So I don't know if I have time, but I was about to finish about that last movie on about Yakamos. It was focusing on blue oceanic post-human vision. So I was about to end that Turkish science fiction literature has a rich global history, serving as a platform of exploring societal issues, technological advancement, and the human condition while reflecting contemporary hopes, fears, and aspirations. Sorry about the PowerPoint issues.
No, thank you. We've all been there.
Buran, I'm sorry, did you have a chance to conclude the way you needed to conclude, or?
Yes.
Yes,
No
okay.
problem. It was the last video, and I had an issue with that one.
Okay, of course, the 1 minute before you finished. Okay,
Okay.
thank you very much. Thank you, Buran. All right, so we will move on to our third and final speaker of the panel, and that is Kamyab Ghorbanpour. Uh, Did I
Yes,
did I
you,
pronounce it
you
correctly?
did an excellent job.
Ghorbanpour. Thank you. Okay, good. Who is a PhD candidate at Tilburg University. His primary area of interest is video games and how media can be utilized to understand human behavior and mind. He's published popular articles in many publications, including Wired, Polygon, and New Arab, tackling a variety of topics from Persian board game culture to digital warfare. His peer-reviewed work on Persian video games delves deeply into the intricacies of the industry, both within and outside Iran, and how dialectic forces have shaped its history. His interest in games and cognitive science is only rivaled by his love for literature. His passion for science fiction has been a defining aspect of his character, guiding him on his current path. His presentation today is titled Trapped in Translation.
Thank you. 1 second, please. Okay. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about Persian science fiction and specifically tackle it from the angle of translation. So I'm going to start by a short story from the Book of Kings, which is essentially the Persian equivalent of the Iliad. It's a national epic of Iran. And the story goes that Kekawis, the famous Shah of Iran, sought to ascend to the heavens. And according to the stories, he crafted the flying throne by harnessing powerful eagles to lift him up into the sky. However, his ambition and pride led him to his downfall as the eagles tired, causing him to fall back to earth. Some consider this story to be the first iteration of science fiction in Persian literature. And you may be surprised by this, mainly because this doesn't really click with people who have a vision of space opera as science fiction or contemporary science fiction as what they think of the definition. Now, this brings us to the question of what is science fiction. I have put two of the classic definitions by earlier scholars of science fiction studies. But there has been some opposition to these, recent opposition to these definitions. For example, specifically on the topic of Afrofuturism, scholars are debating whether Afrofuturism is a genre of its own or merely a response to Eurocentric science fiction. And this sort of ontology of what even is a science fiction is a philosophical question we should think about more deeply when we are delving deep into regional historiography or regional studies of science fiction, because at what point are we defining what is a regional science fiction, or is it merely a response to a Eurocentric science fiction? So when I was a kid and growing up during the 2000s, one thing that struck me was the fact that science fiction movies and literature such as Star Wars was very niche in Iran, so very few people were aware of them, as opposed to fantasy TV shows or literary works such as The Chronicles of Narnia was way more popular and widely read as opposed to something considerably more popular outside of the country, such as Star Wars. And some people have made arguments about this, some scholars such as Michael Stromberg, that because there is this Zoroastrian culture or Persian mythology inside the country that has been for thousands of years, and it inspired many modern contemporary fantasy stories and media. This has inexorably created a drive for Iranians towards science fiction, towards fantasy as opposed to science fiction, meaning that because there is this wealth of Persian mythology, then Iranians have a more drive towards fantasy. But how true that is, it's hard to, it's up to debate, mainly because during the 80s, after the 1979 revolution, there was a massive cultural shift in Iran. Before that, things were quite different. Iranians watched science fiction TV shows and they were very popular. They read science fiction novels such as Asimov's Foundation or shows such as Star Trek, and they were widely watched, they were widely loved all across the country. However, due to a high level of censorship and suppression by the government at the time, the government of the Shah, people weren't able to produce any new content, be it science fiction or fantasy. However, things became far worse after the revolution because Ayatollah Khomeini went on this campaign that anything he deemed Western, liberal, or leftist, a big umbrella of ideas, was considered a threat to his new Islamist state. So this led to a culture shift in consumer products, from books to TV shows. There is an excellent book on this by Blake Otwood on video cassettes and how Iranians during this time created a hidden infrastructure of distributing video cassettes. And this didn't just affect video cassettes, it was with regard to shows, books, music even. And a lot of books such as Asimov's Foundation, as I mentioned, didn't get a reprint and weren't printed at all in Iran until quite recently. So this had a huge impact on how and what kind of media and what kind of exposure people had to the media they consumed. After the revolution, specifically during the late 2000s, there were two scriptwriters called Qasemkhani brothers. They were avid science fiction fans. They were the people who consumed a lot of science fiction before the revolution. And They created a really acclaimed TV show called The Travelers, which is considered to be the first Iranian science fiction show. And much like many of its contemporary shows, Iranian shows that tackled social issues, and it was more of a comedy, it was produced in the same vein, but from a science fiction foundation. And this sort of paved the way for them to produce more shows and content that were in the science fiction genre, such as Once Upon a Time Mars, which is their most latest audition to the television. And this created a momentum inside Iran for people who were curious about this genre to gather around and create a community behind science fiction, around science fiction. One of these early communities that became somewhat considerable was the Fantasy Academy, and its journal to the right, or rather its magazine to the right, says you can see the cover. This was produced by a few science fiction fans and translators who started this new wave of translation after the revolution, mainly because after the Reformation era in Iran, there was less scrutiny, there was less censorship, and basically there was a period of relaxed or comparably relaxed environment for translators and writers to produce new content. And this led to people in this community to translate news stories, science fiction stories, and bring them to the country. To the left, there is the Safid magazine, which was basically a spiritual successor to the Fantasy Academy. This one focused even more on science fiction as opposed to Fantasy Academy, which was both a science fiction community and a fantasy community. And this new wave of translation created a hub for people to talk to each other, associate with each other, and some of these translators, such as Behzad Ghadimi or Mohammad Reza Idrim, they created new stories out of it. Because when people start to translate the stories, they come to the conclusion on why shouldn't we create new ones? All these stories coming from the West are interesting and they inspire us. But we can tell our stories with our own socioeconomic conditions. And this is still quite a small community that gave birth to people like Zoha Kazemi that you're familiar with, and also the two people I mentioned, Behzad Ghadimi and Mohammad Reza Idrim. These stories are quite interesting and worth exploring. Unfortunately, they're extremely under-researched. Behzad Ghadimi's story, for example, a novel which became quite acclaimed in Iran, is about what I would like to call a collective trauma regarding a manufactured collective trauma regarding the Arab conquest of Persia, and which became very prominent in Iranian imagination, especially after the 1979 revolution, because many saw that as a resurgence of the same collective trauma. So it's sort of a response to the Islamization of the society. And Mohammad Reza Idrim's book is a response to to the theocratic nature of the country and exploration of how religion in a totalitarian system can affect you and affect you cognitively, which are essentially products out of this unique socio-economic condition that people are living in. Now, some of these stories, some of these books have been translated, such as Zohar Kazemi's book, but mainly most of these have no translation at all, and there are no localizations. And people outside of the country have a very hard time finding them. In fact, if you search Persian sci-fi, you're probably gonna face the first result you're gonna get on Google is my own article on the topic, which is not great. I wish there was more content, there was more research on this topic. Now, if we look at it in a teleological sense, is this a success story? I wonder. The success of Zohar Kazemi and moderate success of people like Gadimi or Idrim, is this a success story for the history of Persian sci-fi? I don't know. There is a success story with regard to Iran's cinema, and some people might think this is a replication of that, but even that success story is questionable at best. So prior to the revolution, the Iranian cinema was mostly dominated by erotic films, and they weren't widely acclaimed outside of the country. They weren't widely recognized at all. But after the revolution, things slowly shifted and changed. Some directors and creators, such as Asghar Farhadi or Kiarostami, gained international recognition with movies like A Separation, which won an Oscar at the Academy Awards. And people started to interpret this as a success story. But there are new scholarly circles. There are papers that are challenging that notion, that there is a paradox in play, and these individual successes cannot necessarily be interpreted as in an evolutionary sense, a, 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 a positive outcome of the current conditions of Iranian cinema. Now, I'm an expert in none of this actually. My research mainly is about video games. And I have recently published a paper on Iranian video game industry, which also, much like Iran cinema and science fiction, has a troubled history, but perhaps it's an emerging success story. And what I think is important here, what I think matters here, is that these stories are not just a part of our shared history of culture and media, but rather it's a gateway to understanding how these mediums and literature develops differently in different frameworks, in different cultural, metaphysical, and socioeconomic frameworks. So what I have tackled in the paper is a concept I call the Persian dichotomy of games, which essentially is about how the state-sponsored video game industry and what used to be the private sector were in this dialectical relationship that empowered each other at times, but also challenged each other. And the themes that we're playing are the themes that were used in these games. Give us some insight into what was behind the machinations of these creations. And essentially, this dichotomy didn't last, or rather, it shifted and changed drastically. So a lot of people went outside of the country and started to produce new games, games that weren't part of the state-sponsored apparatus. And translation played a huge part in this, because When video games used to be translated inside the country, they were translated through an underground scene. Not unlike the time when all medium was banned and an underground infrastructure was built, due to sanctions and due to Iran's isolation, the translation scene was also very didn't work like most other countries in the globe. And as a result, many of these other machinations for creation work the same way, like creating video game engines. How does that work when you don't have access to regular game engines? And now there are some interesting developments happening, such as the new Prince of Persia game, for the first time getting a Persian translation, or new Iranian games being developed outside of Iran with Persian translations and being produced in English for international audience. But yeah, this was my talk. I'm Kamyab Ghorbanpour. I study at Tilberg University. I'm doing my PhD on video games, and I work in the AI and Cognitive Science department. If you would like to reach me, this is my email. Also, I'm working on a book which is about the history of Iran's video game industry, and translation is a huge part of that. So it would be a pleasure to connect and talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kamyab, for that really interesting talk. And thanks to all three of our speakers. Yes, I'm trying to see if I can find my applause. Yes, my applause. Okay. Thank you all so much. Thank you for the questions, and thank you to the panelists for this really thoughtful discussion and for all your wonderful papers. This was just so much fun. I see that Julie has put up a poll, and I hope you'll all take just a moment to fill it out because it really helps both our centers in putting on events like this. And I also just wanted to remind everyone that in about 1 hour and 15 minutes, you can tune back in for Lavi Tidhal, who will be speaking. So hopefully you can make it to that. And thank you all for coming to this wonderful panel. Thanks again to the panelists.